By 2017, Natalie and Michael Cochran were living the American dream. But even so, comfortable upper-middle-class lives were never enough for the ambitious go-getters like them. Later that year, they started a new business that promised to make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. But a few months and more than $2 million later, the facade they had worked so hard to construct began to crumble like a house of cards. Even so, neither Michael nor any of his friends or family members could have imagined what lengths Natalie would go to cover up the grand deception. Before we begin, we would like to express our sincere condolences to the victim's family for their loss. Natalie and Michael grew up in rural Raleigh County, West Virginia, not far from Virginia to the east and Kentucky to the west. Natalie's parents described her as a smart, quiet, and good-natured child who rarely caused them any trouble. On the other hand, Michael was a die-hard jock and outdoorsman who loved playing baseball, fishing, hunting, and roughhousing with his friends. He and Natalie were polar opposites in many respects, but even so, they started dating seriously in high school. After graduation, Michael attended West Virginia University in Morgantown, where he played baseball and studied information technology. Natalie went to another university, but she eventually transferred to WVU to be with Michael, and because it had a solid pharmacy program. Michael's parents loved Natalie, but they were a little surprised that she moved into the mobile home they had bought for him to use while he was in school. They liked visiting Michael whenever they could, but after Natalie moved in, they often got pushed to the side when her parents were there. As expected, Michael and Natalie eventually got married and had 2 kids of their own. Michael worked in IT while Natalie was a pharmacist for a local healthcare provider. Things were definitely going well, and when they weren't working, they spent as much time together as they could doing things as a family. Michael particularly enjoyed coaching his kids' sports team, and whenever he had free time, he worked out, competed in tough man competitions, and did whatever else he could do to look his best. He was technically a bodybuilder or an MMA fighter, but he took a fair amount of supplements and even used steroids that he had bought online from a supplier in Mexico. In 2017, Natalie quit her job as a pharmacist because she wanted to dedicate her time to starting a new company called Tactical Solutions Group, or TSG. By then, Natalie and Michael had been talking about going into business for themselves for quite some time. At least on the outside, their business model was refreshingly simple. Their plan was to land lucrative state and federal weapons and tactical gear contracts by underbidding the competition. Natalie and Michael didn't have any experience with government contracts or buying and selling weapons for the military and law enforcement agencies. Nonetheless, they were confident that their hard work and dedication would eventually pay off. But first, they needed operating capital. In the early going, Natalie focused on convincing her friends and family members to invest in their promising startup. She even told them that she and Michael had gotten the idea after watching the dark comedy War Dogs starring Jonah Hill and Miles Teller. She even said that they planned on making their new employees watch the movie as part of a training and onboard video process. Of course, most of the prospective investors were skeptical that a cheesy movie could be the basis for a successful business. One woman even reminded Natalie that the main characters in that movie went to jail at the end. It took a lot of convincing, but Natalie and Michael assured everyone that they knew what they were doing and that it was only a matter of time before the contracts and money started rolling in. Michael's mother, Donna Bolt, was one of the first investors. She ultimately coughed up nearly $250,000, and she wasn't the only one. Other friends and family members made hefty 6-figure investments as well. Now flush with other people's money, Natalie and Michael went on a lavish and ostentatious spending spree of epic proportions. In a matter of months, they had bought cars, boats, motorcycles, expensive jewelry, 2 properties, and a 1965 Shelby Cobra, none of which had anything to do with their business. And to top it all off, they took their kids on high-dollar vacations to Paris and Hawaii. In Paris, Michael's daughter Nicole said she regularly bought luxury goods at uber-exclusive shops like Louis Vuitton. And when they got back to the States, Natalie promptly applied for a $100,000 loan from a local bank. She even claimed that TSG had business assets worth more than $500 million. But unbeknownst to Natalie, she was already the subject of a financial investigation. However, it had nothing to do with TSG or the luxury goods that she and Michael had purchased with investors' money. Instead, it stemmed from tens of thousands of dollars that had recently gone missing from a Little League baseball fund, for which Natalie was the treasurer. Before long, a private investigator uncovered more than $30,000 worth of fraudulent purchases that were allegedly made with the money from the Little League Fund. By then, dozens of TSG investors were also starting to wonder if they had been duped and if they would ever see their hard-earned money again. When they confronted Natalie, she asked them to be patient and told them a number of payments that had been delayed due to bureaucratic red tape and government shutdowns should be coming in. At one point, she even claimed that she had cancer and that the treatment was preventing her from spending as much time on the business as she wanted to. By then, Natalie and Michael had blown through much of the $2.5 million they had taken from family members and lifelong friends. As such, Natalie was also trying to secure additional capital from a team of business bankers at a Bank of America branch in Charlottesville, Virginia. On the morning of Wednesday, February the 6th, 2019, she and Michael were supposed to fly there to finalize the deal. At that point, no money had changed hands because the application wasn't quite finished just yet. But as close as they were to getting the additional money they so desperately needed, Natalie and Michael never got on the plane. Later that morning, she told her family that she and Michael both had horrible flu-like symptoms. She even texted Michael's mother a picture of him slumped over on the kitchen table. Michael's mother begged Natalie to take him to the hospital immediately, but she said she didn't want to go and that he'd probably be better in a day or two. But later that day, a number of friends found Michael in a comatose state when they stopped by the house to see how they were. One of the visitors was a family friend and physician's assistant, Stephanie Hamilton, who told Natalie that Michael was in bad shape and that she needed to take him to the hospital ASAP. Natalie eventually gave in and took Michael to a nearby emergency room where doctors quickly diagnosed him with severe swelling of the brain and dangerously low blood glucose. This was odd because Michael wasn't diabetic, but Natalie told them that he regularly took insulin because it had anabolic properties. By then, Michael's mother was beside herself with grief, but Natalie told her not to come to the hospital because she said she was the only one allowed in the room. Even so, Michael's mother drove to the hospital anyway, and to her surprise, the staff immediately let her in to see her son. As soon as she entered the room, she noticed that Natalie wasn't behaving like a concerned wife. In fact, she found her lack of concern and matter-of-fact attitude maddening, inappropriate, and downright suspicious. 38-year-old Michael Cochran occasionally moved and responded to stimuli over the next few days, but he never regained consciousness and died in hospice on Monday, February the 11th of 2019. Since the doctors thought he died of natural causes, no autopsy was performed. Natalie and Michael had been married for 19 years at the time of his death. Per his last wishes, the family only held a private graveside ceremony instead of a traditional funeral. It's unclear whether Natalie knew about it, but behind the scenes, West Virginia State Police detectives were busy investigating Michael's suspicious death. Approximately 4 months later, she found a local businessman who was interested in purchasing 49% of TSG and was buying it for $5 million. He eventually gave her a $50,000 deposit, but investigators showed up at her home with a search warrant in late June of 2019, just before the deal went through. But surprisingly, they weren't investigating Michael's death. Instead, they were following up on allegations that Natalie had conned her investors, that TSG was not a viable business, and that she was running a Ponzi scheme. During the search, investigators confiscated documents, computer files, and electronic devices, and they also found a vial of insulin in the refrigerator. Natalie was not taken into custody or charged with any crimes, but investigators eventually determined that the business was a scam and that she and Michael had never even bid on a single government contract, despite taking more than $2 million from investors. As bad as Ponzi schemes are, the Cochrans was even worse because they intentionally targeted friends and family members. The big question was Michael in on it, or had Natalie pulled the wool over his eyes as well? In the end, investigators concluded that he probably was not involved in the fraud. Natalie filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection the following day and eventually pleaded guilty to the aforementioned charges. In March of 2021, she was sentenced to 11 years in prison and ordered to return nearly $2.5 million of investors' money. In one fell swoop, Natalie had irreparably harmed her relationships with the family and friends who had invested in TSG. And worse yet, her 2 children would have to spend more than a decade with the in-laws because their father had passed away and she was going to prison. But as bad as things were, they were about to get far worse because investigators looking into Michael's death ultimately concluded that he probably did not die from natural causes after all. Michael's body was exhumed approximately 7 months after his death, and shortly thereafter, forensic pathologist Dr. Piotr Kubacek performed an autopsy. But after examining the body and running a number of toxicology tests, he could not determine a cause of death. Then, 4 years later, forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uribe performed another autopsy after Michael's body was exhumed for the second time. By then, Michael was in an advanced state of decomposition, but even so, the doctor concluded that someone had introduced non-prescribed insulin into his body and that his death was a homicide. Natalie was already serving time for the federal money laundering charges when prosecutors charged her with first-degree murder in mid-November of 2021.
The court calls the case of State of West Virginia versus Natalie Cochran. Natalie Cochran, how do you plead to this charge of first-degree murder as alleged against you in indictment number 23-F-343K? Are you guilty or not guilty of such offense?
Not guilty, Your Honor.
Natalie's trial got underway on Wednesday, January the 15th, 2025 at the Raleigh County Circuit Court in Beckley, West Virginia.
On February the 5th of 2019, Michael Cochran was a 200-pound, healthy 38-year-old man. By midday of February 6th of 2019, he had lost consciousness and he would never regain consciousness. He died in hospice care 5 days later, February 11th of 2019.
Defense attorney Matthew Victor argued that Michael was a steroid and insulin user and that he had a well-documented history of relatively serious health issues. He readily admitted that Natalie and Michael bought boats, jewelry, property, and classic cars with their investors' money, but said that she had not injected him with the insulin that sent him into a coma and ultimately killed him. Early on, the prosecution called banker Michael Nexon to testify about working with Natalie during the loan application process.
In terms of the division of your time with the Cochrans, did you spend more time involved with Natalie Cochran or Michael?
The bulk of it was with Natalie. The only thing I recall is one time there was a gentleman on the phone there in the car who said it was Michael Cochran. The rest was pretty much exclusively with Mrs. Cochran.
Were there any funds in this account at this point?
So from our side, there was nothing. So essentially it was, we own these government contracting businesses. We're going to have significant funds coming and going from these accounts, which if it was real, U.S. Trust and the private bank would absolutely be the best place to go to do all this. And so at the time, there's nothing in these accounts. We are essentially getting everything set up or getting the piping in place to allow money to come into the account and then be a real source of financial help. But no, nothing, to my knowledge, at least from a U.S. Trust side, there's nothing ever in the account.
There's an email from the defendant of March 14th of 2019. Could you take a look at that one?
I have that in front of me, correct.
And what did the defendant indicate to you was going to happen then?
So rereading this email, they are asking for wiring information for their account. They've said that $100,000 is coming in. Other government funds are coming. and then she's emailing a death certificate and the state paperwork so we can remove Michael. So in the interim, we've been informed that Michael was in the ICU and then passed. And so in that interim, that's where we are as of March 14th, which is trying to move money around with these accounts.
Michael's best friend, Christopher Davis, testified shortly thereafter.
Tell us your relationship with Michael Cochran.
Mike was one of my best friends. And, we did a lot together and spent a lot of time together. And, we not only personally, but we coached sports together and, vacation together. And he was he is a dear friend.
You miss him?
I do. He was a very strong man. He's a good man. And he would want me to be strong now as well. And he was a good man, a very good man. He wasn't the best father, the best friend, or the best husband, but I'm not either. But he's not what you heard he was. He loved his family. He took care of his family. He loved his friends. He loved his community. Spent a lot of time in the community. He loved life. He wasn't sick. He wasn't ready to die. He was healthy. Even up until the day he died. He had plans. He had lots of plans. He was doing lots of things. He couldn't wait to the things he was doing. And that was also for his family.
Next, physician's assistant and family friend Stephanie Hamilton took the stand.
She had texted me and told me that she had pneumonia, and she was still coughing really bad, and she wanted to know if she could get some steroids. She asked me if I told her that was fine. I usually do pills. She asked for a shot. So I was going to give her that, send it in for her to the pharmacy, and I asked her if she wanted me to come by and give it to her. She said no, that she could administer it.
And what did you prescribe for her pneumonia?
Solumedrol.
Generally speaking, what is that?
That is a steroid.
And that's the medication you offered to in pill form, but she wanted an injectable.
Prednisone pill form, but she wanted an injection. She asked for Solumedrol.
Okay. And an injection, is there any way to use the item you prescribed, the specific item, without needles?
No. Michael was laying on the couch. John, one thing on the phone that John had asked me to do was to bring a thermometer, that Natalie didn't have one. So when I got there, he was laying on the couch sleeping. Michael was laying on the couch sleeping. She had the blood pressure cuff on his arm. There was numbers on it as if it had just been taken. She had the pulse ox on his finger, which monitors like oxygen rate and pulse rate. And that all looked normal. Nothing alarmed me when I saw the numbers. The only thing I had with me was the thermometer that they had asked me to bring, which was a ear scan. I walked over to him and
Walked over to Michael.
He was laying on the couch, and went to take his temperature and told him, Michael, this is Stephanie, because I knew how Michael was. If he had just woke up and saw me standing there, he might punch me. So I said, Michael, it's Stephanie. Don't hit me. I'm going to take your temperature. And he turned his head towards me. I took his temperature. It was fine. And then he was laying on the couch. They had a recliner that kind of sat behind the couch. And I sat down in the recliner. So his head was behind. I was behind his head. He was in there. And talked to Natalie and John for a few minutes to see what had happened and what was going on.
What were you told had happened?
I was told that, I knew.
Unless it's a statement of the defendant, I object to hear.
Fair enough. Did the defendant tell you what happened? Did Natalie Cochran tell you what happened?
Yes.
What did she say?
She told me that they had been sick that morning, which she had said through text. She said he was throwing up and he had a seizure or something in the kitchen and fell on the floor.
Did you ever advise her not to have him checked by you?
Never.
What did you specifically advise her?
That he needed to be checked. She told me that he had a history of seizures and he had stopped taking his medication. And I said, he has to be checked. I said, even people with the history of seizures, anytime they have one, they need to be checked. We never know which one's damaging. And she said she was going to let him check it off. I kept offering, I would go with her. We would go, we could bypass Raleigh General if that's not what they were wanting to do. We could go to Charleston. She said he wasn't happy at Charleston either. I mentioned Princeton. Nothing was good enough.
Investigator Robert Heinesman also testified about financial improprieties he found while investigating Natalie and TSG.
Natalie Cochran was attempting to sell off this business at that time.
What was the gross price for the business?
She was attempting to sell the business for $4.9 million to a local businessman.
And a local businessman, did they do anything to further the sale?
Yes.
A deposit, that kind
Yes.
of? Tell us about that.
This entire thing occurred over a 6-day period prior to the execution of the search warrant. Her and this individual had met and he agreed on buying a partnership interest of this business. And she contacted him a day after, 1 to 2 days afterwards, and said that she needed a deposit placed on his purchase interest, a $50,000 deposit. And he wired her $50,000 the day before the search warrant was executed.
49% of the business that the purchaser was buying, what kind of assets was the purchaser purchasing?
This buyer was led to believe he was buying a 49% interest in the business and assets that had been described to him that were associated with the business. He had been told that there was a fleet of vehicles, that there was an airplane that was an asset of the vehicle, and other business assets that they had at that time, the business location on Eisenhower Drive, and any other assets associated with the business.
So the $4.9 million deal that never got fully executed, what time frame are we talking about?
This was June 25th, 2019, when I made contact and told this individual not to wire any more money to her.
And that's because why?
Because we had determined at that point that the business was fraudulent, the contracts were fraudulent, there was no money, there was nothing for him to purchase.
Natalie initially indicated that she would testify on her own behalf, but as the trial drew to a close, her defense team informed the court that she no longer wished to take the stand. After closing arguments and final instructions, the judge dismissed the jury for deliberations. All told, they needed less than 2 hours to reach a decision.
In the case of State of West Virginia versus Natalie Page Cochran, case number 23-F-343K, the jury verdict is as follows. We, the jury on the issues, joined unanimously find the following. The defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree. Foreperson of the jury, it is dated 1/29/2025. There are no marks on the portion of the verdict form pertaining to involuntary manslaughter. Does the state wish to examine the jury verdict form?
Very good, thank you.
Does the defense?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
You may be seated. Is there a request for the court to poll the jury?
Not from the state, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
All right. The verdict is received by the court and directed to be recorded. I'll ask the state to prepare an appropriate order in the premises. The court accepts the jury verdict and finds this defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
Before the sentencing phase of the trial, the judge permitted friends and family members on both sides to deliver victim impact statements.
Evil must be held accountable. Natalie Cochran must be held accountable. Life in prison for a premeditated murder may seem fair, but what I think is just would be to take a rope over here to the courthouse, throw it over the branch of that big oak tree.
Because he was a minor, Natalie's son was only identified as MAC.
She's going to prison. The question here today is, does she go to prison for the rest of her life, or is she eligible for parole in 15 years for mercy? How do you think you need your mother in your life, or even if you think you need your mother in your life from this point forward?
I want my kids to have a grandmother. I want them to know her. I want them to be able to go over to their grandma's house and have Christmas and spend time with her.
Would you like her to be around and possibly out of prison if you get married or anything like that?
Yes.
Everyone knew Natalie was going to prison because the jury had already found her guilty. That said, the victim impact statements were particularly relevant because they might sway the judge to give her life without parole or to make her eligible for parole after 15 years.
It is the judgment and ruling of the court that the defendant, Natalie Page Cochran, be, and she is committed to the penitentiary of this state for her natural life without the possibility of parole.